So about 30 years ago, I was part of a research project in which I had to be in classrooms, in schools, like a fly on the wall, at the back of the classroom, like a part of the furniture that people stopped noticing because you were there all the time. And I had to write down whatever was happening in that classroom, list everything from whatever the students were doing to what the teacher was doing. And it sounds difficult to do when I tell you it was 600 days over 3 years that I did that. In those 600 days, there were times when I had to battle fatigue, exhaustion, because the teacher would come in regularly, day after day, and say, okay, open chapter 3, page 15, and then would explain in excruciating detail pretty much everything in that chapter to the students. And it was difficult to understand what the children were getting out of it and what the teacher was trying to do. It was only then that I began to realize that you can tell what good teaching and learning is all about, because then there were those classrooms which would come alive. And that's when the teacher was aware of why she was doing what she was doing. The children had the ability to ask a lot of questions. They were able to talk to each other. They were able to have discussions about things that were outside of that little textbook framework. And that's when you saw the learning actually happen in the classroom. So the question for me as a researcher was, why is it that if it's so obvious to anyone sitting in the classroom that good teaching and learning is all about children getting engaged, involved, being part of the learning, why wouldn't someone want that to happen on a daily basis? Why is it that teachers tend to use that textbook as a crutch to stop that connection that they can have with students? So 10 years later, when I got a chance to set up a school, I decided that we're going to do something differently. There was enough that was known about what education actually did for students, and which parts of education were something that facilitated student learning, and things like textbooks which were known to actually stop children from learning and get focused only on exam grades. So with the teachers who came into the school, I said, fine, let's try this out. No textbooks, no examinations. Now what? So what do you think happened? And I can imagine you sort of looking at a school like that and saying, how is it even possible? But it was. And the first thing the teacher said to me was, how are we going to do this? Because we're so used to textbooks. How are we going to examine the children? What will they need to learn to study for the examinations? And if they don't have examinations, how will we know whether they've learned anything or not? So I said, okay, let's go find out. Let's go find out by asking the students what they want to study. And that's how it began. So we started asking, they started every class by saying, what do you want to learn? How do we get that understanding from you as to what you want to investigate? And then how do we as teachers create that collaborative space for you to find out? And you'd be amazed at the kind of questions children asked. So if we said, let's study birds together, what would you like to learn? Children asked us, well, why do we only see crows and parrots and pigeons in Mumbai? Why don't we see peacocks and kingfishers? Where do we see these different birds coming in winter? And why do they come to Bombay? And that's the kind of stuff that wasn't in a textbook. So for doing that, we created a collaborative space where teachers could sit together and say, how do we answer these questions? Or how do we get children to look out for these answers? And so that there were classes moving to libraries to look at books. They were moving into the computer lab to study on the internet what birds do and how they migrate. And that's when a whole curriculum began to emerge, where the school from standard, the junior KG up to the 10th, was able to say, this is what we really want to study. What's interesting is, I just recently had a talk at a media college, and I asked the students over there, what do you want to study, and what is it that you wish had happened in school that you knew? And of course, the first thing the students said to me was, one of the boys in the audience said, well, I wish they had taught us about sex education. And of course, that was the first thing he would have said to me, wouldn't it be? And then there was a lot of other conversations that began. Why didn't we know about law? Why didn't we know about finance? Why didn't we learn about banking? How do we deal with ourselves when we go to the world of work? how do we stand for an interview? These are the kinds of things that children wanted to learn in school. Wasn't in the curriculum. So when in Shishuvan, the school that I started, we had this happen, we were freed from the tyranny of the textbook. And because we were freed from it, what we could do was go out, take the children out. We went to Kutch, we built mud houses, we came back to school and found out that if you put a lap of cow dung on the floor, then the insects don't come in. And so we came back and decided to show the parents of the children what they had learned. So when parents came in, the children actually demonstrated what they had learned in the village to them. And one of my favorite pictures and images is of a little girl holding her nose because she didn't like the smell, but doing the lap on the floor. And that's what it's all about. It's about the child saying, I'm going to push my boundaries and get out of my comfort zone because I don't want to lose that experience of being able to do something that really makes sense to me. And I can now see the connection between what animals do, what the environment does, and how my books or what I have in the library, what I learn from other people, when an ornithologist comes and talks to me in school, this is what I can now understand and make sense of. So it was a great experience. I've had all kinds of questions being asked of me. I've had, because children were encouraged to ask questions, I've had questions like, why is my mother's stomach sort of growing? What's happening inside? And is there really a baby that's going to come out of there? I've had students ask me, well, you know, I've heard the girls in my class talking about waxing. And as a boy, do I need to wax? And these are real concerns, interests, and fears and worries. And if you don't have that space in a classroom to know what children actually want to learn about, how do you address issues of gender? How do you address issues of what is it about human development that you want to know as a young person growing in this world? If you want that to happen, if you want a classroom of the kind where children ask a lot of questions, every kind of question, you have to have teachers who are willing to listen and willing to say, okay, whatever it is that a child asks, how do I use that to create a curriculum? So for that, you need a collaborative space to happen inside a staff room. And what I found myself doing when I was leading that school was these three things. I found myself actually communicating the ideas, not just me communicating, but the children communicating with the teachers with each other, communicating in order to collaborate. So the idea was that you have a situation where a child says, I want to learn about migration, or I want to learn about bird nests. So you talk about, in the staff room, you talk about how is it going to be possible to make that experience something real for a child? How do we take them out to see the migratory birds? How do we take them to the Natural History Museum? And these things required collaboration between teachers. So the collaboration was being done for a very, very clear purpose. For me, it was absolutely important that the school should be a meaningful space for everyone that came in there. Whether it was parents, students, teachers, whoever was in that space should have come into that school wanting to learn something. And we should be welcoming that space as, yes, we want your questions, we want you to find out what you want to learn, and that's a school for a whole community. It's the heart of a community, because you're growing your future in it. It's great to have a school which is on the top of the lists, on all the charts, and it's great to have that school grow into a space where every teacher, every child, and everyone was doing something that was useful, important, and they felt a sense of importance. But the question that then came up in my mind was, what happens in all the other schools? What's going on there? So to find out, there's only one way to do it, isn't it? I had to move out of the school and start a community, a professional community of school leaders, all of whom had these questions in their mind about how do we make school into something that is interesting and exciting for children. You spend years of your life in school. There are children coming into school at the age of 3, and then they leave school when they're 18 years old. And you don't want to look at 15 years of a person's life being spent simply learning by rote everything they're going to forget as soon as the exam is over. That's not what you want to do in a school. So if we had to shift from that space as a set of schools, as many schools as possible, all of the school leaders across this country had to be involved in that discussion. And so Adhyayan was created, which is a movement of school leaders and owners, where we get together to look at how our school can become a space where everyone feels that they are learning, and they're learning with fun. I think the human race is the only one where they put the young people into boxes. And they say, okay, here's this classroom. You sit in there, and we'll tell you what it's all about outside. Everybody else, every other species, if you notice, the birds, once they feel that their young are old enough, they start pushing them out of the nest. Or if they are animals who are growing up, you don't find them saying, okay, come into this space and sit down and I'll tell you everything. They say, go out there, forage, find your food, learn how to deal with the world, figure out what's going on. We don't do that. So if we want schools to be spaces that look like prisons, we're succeeding. If we don't want them to, if we want them to look like open spaces, porous, living, breathing, organic spaces, then what we have to do is listen to each other. So as leaders, as people who run schools, we began to sit together, small schools, people who run schools in villages, tiny little schools with 140 children, to very large schools which have a lot of students who are doing the IB or the IGCSE or different boards, and we sit together and began to say, what is it that makes school interesting and exciting for students? How do we make them want to be in the classroom rather than coming to school because their parents say you have to go to school? And this has led to situations where we find different solutions. There are different kinds of people who run schools with different perspectives. But all of them have begun to realize that what I did 30 years ago is where it all starts. So every school leader has to get into class. Every school leader has to be there looking at what's going on. Are the children actually somewhere else while they're looking at the teacher? Or are they paying attention? How do you know they're paying attention? How does a school leader find out? And to create that ability to find out, you have to be able to listen to each other. So the way Adhyayan works is we've got a framework for school review, and we have all of the stakeholders across the school. So you have a collaborative team of students, teachers, parents, alumni, management, all coming together. They begin to talk about what good looks like, what good teaching and learning looks like. They go into their classrooms. They identify what's happening in their schools, which is exciting, where children are happy, joyous, learning. And they identify places where it is not exciting for the children. And through that process, they begin to listen to each other. And I've been in those rooms when the principal will say, yeah, we've got everything in our school where the children have brought their bags. So they've got the implements, they have the textbooks, they have the pens, the pencils. And then the child in that collaborative space says, sir, they're always borrowing my pen from me. So I know that everybody doesn't bring what they're supposed to bring to school. And that's when the listening begins to happen to each other. So when across this community of now 300 schools, we begin to communicate what good learning is all about, what good listening is about, what children are saying, where we listen to teachers who say we don't have time to actually correct books, so can we relook at timetables? And from each other's learning, where we ask questions of each other, we find out how are you dealing with these issues, how are you training all of the teachers in your school, and how are they then working with children to make collaborative spaces. That's when we begin to see change happening. So if, as a whole set of schools across this country, if 100,000 schools were to actually do this with us, and that's the invitation, if we were to all communicate what good teaching and learning is all about, if we were to collaborate to make it shift into listening to children rather than telling children. And if we then create an education system where it actually supports learning, where children feel that they are achieving and moving forward, then we've cracked it as the educators. So that is the invitation. Thank you very much.